Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche, Part 5, on the natural history of morals. In Europe these days, moral sentiment is just as refined, late, multiple, sensitive, and subtle as the science of morals, which belongs with it, is young, neophyte, clumsy, and crude. An attractive contrast, and one that occasionally becomes visible, embodied in the person of the moralist himself. Considering what it signifies, the very phrase, science of morals, is much too arrogant and offends good taste, which always tends to prefer more modest terms. We should admit to ourselves with all due severity exactly what will be necessary for a long time to come and what is provisionally correct, namely, collecting material, formulating concepts, and putting into order the tremendous realm of tender value feelings and value distinctions that live, grow, reproduce, and are destroyed, and perhaps attempting to illustrate the recurring and more frequent shapes of this living crystallization, all of which would be a preparation for a typology of morals. Of course, people have not generally been this modest. Philosophers have all demanded, with ridiculously stubborn seriousness, something much more exalted, ambitious, and solemn as soon as they took up morality as a science. They wanted morality to be grounded. And every philosopher so far has thought that he has provided a ground for morality. Morality itself, however, was thought to be given. What a distance between this sort of crass pride and that supposedly modest little descriptive project left in rot and ruin. Even though the subtlest hands and senses could hardly be subtle enough for it, precisely because moral philosophers had only a crude knowledge of moral facta, selected arbitrarily and abbreviated at random. For instance, as the morality of their surroundings, their class, their church, their zeitgeist, their climate and region, precisely because they were poorly informed and not particularly eager to learn more about peoples, ages, and histories. They completely missed out on the genuine problems involved in morality. Problems that only emerge from a comparison of many different moralities. As strange as it might sound, the problem of morality itself has been missing from every science of morals so far. There was no suspicion that anything was really a problem. Viewed properly, the grounding of morals, as philosophers called it, as they demanded it of themselves, was only an erudite form of good faith in the dominant morality, a new way of expressing it. As such, it was itself already situated within the terms of a certain morality. In the last analysis, it even constitutes a type of denial that these morals can be regarded as a problem. But in any event, it is the opposite of an examination, dissection, interrogation, vivisection of precisely this article of faith. For example, let us listen to the almost admirable innocence with which even Schopenhauer describes his own project, and then we can draw our conclusions as to how scientific a science could be when its ultimate masters are still talking like children or old women. The principle, he says, page 136 of the Grundproblem der Moral, the fundamental claim on whose content all ethicists actually agree. Neminem laid imo omnes quantum potes juva. This is actually the claim that all moralists attempt to ground. The actual foundation of ethics that people have sought for millennia, just as they have looked for the philosopher's stone. The difficulty involved in grounding the claim just cited might be great indeed. Schopenhauer himself came up famously short in this regard, and anyone who has ever truly felt how inanely false and sentimental this claim is in a world whose essence is will to power, they might recall that Schopenhauer, pessimism notwithstanding, actually played the flute every day after dinner. You can read it in his biography, and just out of curiosity, a pessimist who negates both God and world but stops before morality, who affirms morality and plays his flute, affirms laid nimminum morality. Excuse me, is this really a pessimist? Apart from the value of claims like there is a categorical imperative in us, the question remains, what do claims like this tell us about the people who make them? There are moralities that are supposed to justify their creator in the eyes of others, and other moralities that are supposed to calm him down and allow him to be content with himself. Still, other moralities allow him to crucify and humiliate himself. He can use some moralities to take revenge, others to hide, and still others to transfigure himself and place himself far and away. There are moralities that help their creator to forget, and others that let him or something about him be forgotten. Many moralists would like to wield power and impose their creative whims on humanity. Many others, perhaps even Kant himself, want to make it clear through their morality that the worthy thing about me is that I can obey, and it should be the same for you as it is for me. In short, even morality is just a sign language of the affects. Even morality, as opposed to laissez-aller, is a piece of tyranny against both nature and reason. But this in itself is no objection. For that, we would have to issue yet another decree based on some other morality forbidding every sort of tyranny and unreason. What is essential and invaluable about every morality is that it is a long compulsion. In order to understand Stoicism or Port Royal or Puritanism, just remember the compulsion under which every language so far has developed strength and freedom. the compulsion of meter, the tyranny of rhyme and rhythm. Look at how much trouble the poets and the orators of every country have to go through, including some of today's prose writers who have an inexorable conscience in their ear, and all for the sake of some stupidity, as utilitarian fools say, and think they are clever for saying it, or in obsequious submission to arbitrary laws, as anarchists say, and then imagine themselves free, even free-spirited. But the strange fact is that everything there is or was of freedom, subtlety, boldness, dance, or masterly assurance on earth, whether in thinking itself, or in ruling, or in speaking and persuading, in artistic just as in ethical practices, has only developed by virtue of the tyranny of such arbitrary laws. And, in all seriousness, it is not at all improbable that this is what is nature and natural, and not that laissez-aller. Every artist knows how far removed this feeling of letting go is from his most natural state. The free ordering, placing, disposing, and shaping in the moment of inspiration. He knows how strictly and subtly he obeys thousands of laws at this very moment. Laws that defy conceptual formulation precisely because of their hardness and determinateness. Compared with these laws, there is something floundering, multiple, and ambiguous about even the most solid concept. I will say it again. What seems to be essential in heaven and on earth is that there be obedience in one direction for a long time. In the long term, this always brings and has brought about something that makes life on earth worth living. For instance, virtue, art, music, dance, reason, intellect. Something that transfigures, something refined, fantastic, and divine. The long unfreedom of spirit, the mistrustful constraint in the communicability of thought, the discipline that thinkers imposed on themselves, thinking within certain guidelines imposed by the church or court or Aristotelian presuppositions. The long spiritual will to interpret every event according to a Christian scheme and to rediscover and justify the Christian God in every chance event. All this violence, arbitrariness, harshness, terror, and anti-reason has shown itself to be the means through which strength, reckless curiosity, and subtle agility have been bred into the European spirit. Admittedly, this also entailed an irreplaceable loss of force and spirit, which have had to be crushed, stifled, and ruined. Since here, just like everywhere else, nature shows itself in its utterly wasteful and indifferent glory, which is outrageous but noble. The fact that for thousands of years, European thinkers have been thinking only in order to prove something. These days, it is the other way around. We are suspicious of any thinker who has something to prove. The fact that the results which were supposed to emerge from their most intense contemplations were in fact already firmly established, somewhat like earlier Asian astrology, or even the present-day innocuous Christian moral interpretation of the most personal events to the glory of God and to save the soul. This tyranny, this arbitrariness, this stern and grandiose stupidity has trained the spirit. Slavery, in both the crude and refined senses of the term, seems to be the indispensable means of disciplining and breeding even the spirit. We can look at every morality in the following way. Whatever nature it contains teaches us to hate the laissez-aller, the all too great freedom, and plants in us the need for limited horizons and the closest tasks. It teaches a narrowing of perspective, and so, in a certain sense, stupidity as a condition for life and growth. you should obey someone, anyone, and for a long time, or else you will deteriorate and lose all respect for yourself. This seems to me to be the moral imperative of nature, which is clearly neither categorical, as the old Kant demanded it to be, hence the or else, nor directed to the individual. What does nature care about the individual? But rather to peoples, races, ages, classes, and above all to the whole human animal, to the human. The industrious races find it extremely difficult to tolerate idleness. It was a stroke of genius on the part of the English instinct to spend Sundays in tedium with a te deum, so that the English people would unconsciously lust for their week and work days. It is the same type of cleverly invented, cleverly interpolated period of fasting that you will find all over the ancient world. Although there, as often the case with southern peoples, it is not exactly associated with work. There need to be many types of fasts. And wherever powerful drives and habits rule, the lawmakers have to be sure to put in leap days when these drives are chained up and made to relearn what hunger feels like. Entire generations or epochs emerging in the grips of some moral fanaticism or another seem, from a higher viewpoint, to be just such interposed periods of compulsion and fasting. The times when a drive learns to cower and submit, but also to keep itself clean and sharp. Some philosophical sects can be interpreted in this way as well, like the Stoa in the midst of a Hellenistic culture whose air had become heavy and lascivious with the fragrance of aphrodisiacs. This also suggests an explanation for the paradox of why it was precisely during Europe's Christian period, and only under the pressure of Christian value judgments, that the sex drive sublimated itself into love. There is something in Plato's moral philosophy that does not really belong to him, but is there in spite of him, as it were. Namely, the Socratism that he was really too noble for. Nobody wants to harm himself, and therefore everything bad happens involuntarily. The bad man brings harm to himself, and he would not do so if he knew badness was bad. Accordingly, people are bad only through error. If the error is removed, they will necessarily become good. This type of inference stinks of the rabble, who see only the disagreeable effects of bad actions and are in fact judging. It is stupid to act badly while assuming that good is identical with useful and pleasant. If you start off with the assumption that this is the origin of every utilitarian morality, and then follow your nose, you will rarely go wrong. Plato did everything he could to interpret something refined and noble into his teacher's claim. Above all, himself, him, the most daring of all interpreters, who treated the whole of Socrates just like someone might treat a popular theme or folk song from the streets, varying it to the point of infinity and impossibility, into all his own masks and multitudes, as a joke, and a Homeric one at that. What is the Platonic Socrates? The old theological problem of faith and knowledge, or to be more precise, of instinct and reason. And so, the question of whether, with respect to the value of things, the instincts deserve more authority than reason. Reason wants some ground or what for, some purpose or utility behind our values and actions. This is the same old moral problem that first emerged in the person of Socrates, and divided opinions long before Christianity came along. Socrates, of course, had initially sided with reason, given the taste of his talent, that of a superior dialectician. And, in point of fact, didn't he spend his whole life laughing at the shortcomings of his clumsy, noble Athenians who, like all noble people, were men of instinct and could never really account for why they acted the way they did? But in the end, silently and secretly, he laughed at himself as well. With his acute conscience and self-scrutiny, he discovered the same difficulty and shortcoming in himself. Why free ourselves from the instincts, he asked himself. We should give them their fair dues, along with reason. We have to follow our instincts, but persuade reason to come to their aid with good motives. This was the genuine falseness of that great secretive ironist. He made his conscience seem satisfied with a type of self-deceit. Basically, he had seen through to the irrationality of moral judgments. Plato, who was more innocent in such matters, and lacked Socrates' plebeian craftiness, wanted to use all his strength, the greatest strength a philosopher had ever had at his disposal, to prove to himself that reason and the instincts converge independently on a single goal, on the good, or God. And ever since Plato, all theologians and philosophers have been on the same track. Which is to say, in matters of morality, it has been instinct, or, as the Christians say, faith, or, as I say, the herd, that has had the upper hand so far. Descartes was an exception. As the father of rationalism, and consequently grandfather of the revolution, who granted authority to reason alone. But reason is only a tool, and Descartes was superficial. Anyone who investigates the history of a particular science will find in its development, a clue to the understanding the oldest and most secret processes of all knowledge and cognition. There, as here, rash hypotheses, fictions, the dumb good will to believe, in the lack of mistrust and patience develop first. Our senses learn late and never fully learn to be refined. Trusty, careful organs of knowledge. Given some stimulus, our eyes find it more convenient to reproduce an image that they have often produced before than to register what is different and new about an impression. The latter requires more strength, more morality. It is awkward and difficult for the ear to hear something new. We are bad at listening to unfamiliar music. When we hear another language, we involuntarily try to form the sounds we hear into words that sound more comfortable and familiar to us. For instance, German people at one point heard arqueballista and made it into the word armbrust. Even our senses greet everything novel with reluctance and hostility. And effects are like fear, love, and hate, as well as passive effects of laziness, will be dominant during even the simplest processes of sensibility. Just as little as today's reader takes in all the individual words, or especially syllables on a page, he catches maybe 5 out of 20 words and guesses what these 5 arbitrary words might possibly mean. Just as little do we see a tree precisely and completely, with respect to leaves, branches, colors, and shape. We find it so much easier to imagine an approximate tree instead. Even in the middle of the strangest experiences, we do the same thing. We invent most of the experience and can barely be made not to regard ourselves as the inventor of some process. What all this amounts to is, we are, from the bottom up and across the ages, used to lying. Or, to put the point more virtuously, more hypocritically, and, in short, more pleasantly, people are much more artistic than they think. In the middle of a lively conversation, I will often see the other person's face expressing his thoughts, or the thoughts I attribute to him, with a degree of clarity and detail that far exceeds the power of my visual ability. Such subtlety of muscle movement and ocular expression must have come from my own imagination. In all likelihood, the person had an entirely different expression, or none at all. Quid lux fui tenebri agit, but vice versa too. What we experience in dreams, as long as we experience it often enough, ends up belonging to the total economy of our soul, just as much as anything we have really experienced. Such experiences make us richer or poorer. We have one need more or less. And finally, in the bright light of day, and even in the clearest moments when minds are wide awake, we are coddled a little by the habits of our dreams. Suppose someone frequently dreams that he is flying. And as soon as he starts dreaming, he becomes aware of the art and ability of flight as his privilege, as well as his most particular, most enviable happiness. Someone like this, who thinks he can negotiate every type of curve and corner with the slightest impulse, who knows the feeling of an assured, divine ease and upwards without tension or force, a downwards without condensation or abasement, without heaviness. How could someone with dream experiences and dream habits like these not see the word happiness is colored and determined differently in his waking day too? How could his demands for happiness not be different compared to this flying, the soaring upwards that the poets describe will have to be too terrestrial, muscular, violent, even too heavy for him? Human diversity is apparent not only in the variety of people's tables of goods, which is to say the fact that they consider different goods worthwhile and that they disagree with each other as to the more or less of values. The rank order of commonly acknowledged goods. Diversity is much more evident in what they think counts as actually owning and possessing a good. When it comes to a woman, for instance, a more modest person might consider disposal over her body and sexual usage as sufficient and satisfactory signs of possession, of ownership. Someone else with a more suspicious and demanding thirst for possession will see the question mark here. The fact that this is only the appearance of possession. Such a person will want to examine more closely in order to be particularly clear as to whether the woman will give not only herself to him, but also give up what she has or wants for the sake of him. Only this will count as possession for him. But even this would not satisfy the mistrust and possessive desires of a third person who asks himself whether the woman who gives up everything for his sake is not doing this for some sort of a fantasized version of him. He wants to be thoroughly, even meticulously well known before he is able to be loved at all. He does not dare to let anyone figure him out. He will not feel that he possesses his beloved fully until she harbors no illusions about him, until she loves him just as much for his devilishness and hidden inexhaustibility as for his goodness, patience, and spirituality. Someone might want to possess a people. He finds all the higher arts of the Cagliostro and Catalina suited to his goal. Someone else with a more subtle thirst for possession will say to himself, one should not deceive where one wants to possess. He becomes irritated and impatient at the thought that a mask of himself rules the hearts of the people. Which is why I have to let myself be known, and above all, known to myself. Among helpful and charitable people, you typically discover that clumsy piece of deceit that makes somebody ready before helping him. For instance, acting as if he deserves help requires precisely their help and will prove to be deeply grateful, devoted, and obsequious for any help they give him. With these fantasies, they treat the needy like their own property, since they are helpful and charitable out of a desire for property. You will find them jealous if you cross them while they are being charitable, or beat them to it. Parents involuntarily make children into something similar to themselves and call it bringing them up. No mother doubts at the bottom of her heart that in the child she has given birth to a piece of property. No father questions his right to subject the child to his own ideas and valuations. In fact, there was a time among the ancient Germans, for instance, when it seemed fair that the father should dispose of the life and death of the newborn as he saw fit. And now, It is the teacher, the social class, the priest, and the prince who, like the father, see every new person as an incontrovertible opportunity for a new possession, and it follows from this. The Jews, a people born for slavery, as Tacitus and the entire ancient world say. The people chosen of all peoples, as they themselves say and think. The Jews have achieved that miraculous thing, an inversion of values, thanks to which life on earth has had a new and dangerous charm for several millennia. Their prophets melted together rich, godless, evil, violent, sensual, and for the first time coined an insult out of the word world. The significance of the Jewish people lies in this inversion of values, which includes using the word poor as a synonym for holy and friend. The slave revolt in morality begins with the Jews. We infer the existence of innumerable dark bodies lying close to the sun, ones that we will never see. Between you and me, this is a parable, and a psychologist of morals will read the entire book of the stars only as a language of signs and parables in which much is left silent. You utterly fail to understand beasts of prey and men of prey, like Caesar Borgia. You fail to understand nature if you are still looking for a disease at the heart of these healthiest of all tropical monsters and growths, or particularly if you are looking for some innate hell in them, as almost all moralists so far have done. Does it seem that moralists harbor a hatred against tropics and primeval forests, and that they need to discredit the tropical man at all cost, whether as a disease or degeneration of man? or as his own hell and self-martyrdom. But why? In favor of temperate zones, in favor of temperate men, of moralists, of the mediocre. This for the chapter, Morality as Timidity. All these morals directed at the individual person to promote what people call his happiness. Are they anything other than recommendations for constraint in proportion to the degree of danger in which the individual person lives his life or cures for his passions, his good and bad tendencies, to the extent that they have will to power and want to play master? Or large or small acts of cleverness and artifice, tainted with the stale smell of old folk remedies and old wives' wisdom. They are all baroque in form and unreasonable because they are directed at everyone, because they generalize what should not be generalized. They all speak unconditionally, consider themselves unconditional. They are all seasoned with more than just one grain of salt. In fact, they only become tolerable and occasionally even seductive when they learn to smell overspiced, dangerous, and, above all, otherworldly. On an intellectual scale, all this is of little value and not even remotely scientific, let alone wise. Instead, to say it again and again and again, it is clever, clever, clever mixed with stupid, stupid, stupid. Whether we are talking about that indifference and stone column coldness which the Stoics prescribed and applied as a cure for the feverish idiocy of the affects, or that no more laughter, no more tears of Spinoza, who so naively champions the destruction of the affects through analysis and vivisection, or that method of tuning down the affects to a harmless mean where they might be satisfied. The Aristotelianism of morals, or even morality, as the enjoyment of affects, intentionally watered down and spiritualized through the symbolism of art, like music, for instance, or the love of God and the love of men for the sake of God. Since in religion, the passions regain their civil rights, provided that And finally, even that easy and high-spirited surrender to the affects taught by Hafiz and Goethe, that bold slackening of the reins, that spiritual, physical licentia morum in the special cases of smart old eccentrics and drunks, where there isn't much danger anymore. This also for the chapter, Morality as Timidity. For as long as there have been people, there have been herds of people as well. Racial groups, communities, tribes, folk, states, churches, and a very large number of people who obey compared to relatively few who command. So considering the fact that humanity has been the best and most long-standing breeding ground for the cultivation of obedience so far, it is reasonable to suppose that the average person has an innate need to obey as a type of formal conscience that commands, thou shalt unconditionally do something, unconditionally not do something. In short, thou shalt. This need tries to satisfy itself and give its form a content. So, like a crude appetite, it indiscriminately grabs hold and accepts whatever gets screamed into its ear by some commander or another. A parent, a teacher, the law, class prejudice, public opinion, according to its strength, impatience, and tension. The oddly limited character of human development, its hesitancy and lengthiness, its frequent regressions and reversals, is due to the fact that the herd instinct of obedience is inherited the best and at the cost of the art of commanding. If we imagine this instinct ever advancing to its furthest excesses, in the end there will be nobody with independence or the ability to command. Or such people will suffer inwardly from bad consciences in a need to fool themselves into thinking that they too are only obeying before they are able to command. This is in fact the situation in Europe today. I call it the moral hypocrisy of the commanders. They do not know how to protect themselves from their bad consciences except by acting like executors of older and higher commands from their ancestors' constitution, justice system, laws, or God himself, or even by borrowing herd maxims from the herd mentality, such as the first servants of the people, or the instruments of the commonweal. For his part, the herdman of today's Europe gives himself the appearance of being the only permissible type of man, and glorifies those characteristics that make him tame, easygoing, and useful to the herd as the true human virtues, namely public spirit, goodwill, consideration, industry, moderation, modesty, clemency, and pity. But in those cases where people think they cannot do without a leader and bellwether, they keep trying to replace the commander with an agglomeration of clever herd men. This is the origin of all representative constitutions. For example, what a relief it is for these European herd animals. What a deliverance from an increasingly intolerable pressure when, in spite of everything, someone appears who can issue unconditional commands. The impact of Napoleon's appearance is the last major piece of evidence for this. The history of Napoleon's impact is practically the history of the higher happiness attained by this whole century in its most worthwhile people and moments. In an age of disintegration, where the races are mixed together, a person will have the legacy of multiple lineages in his body, which means conflicting, and often not merely conflicting, drives and value standards that fight with each other and rarely leave each other alone. A man like this, of late cultures and refracted lights, will typically be a weaker person. His most basic desire is for an end to the war that he is. His notion of happiness corresponds to that of a medicine and mentality of pacification. For instance, the Epicurean or Christian. It is a notion of happiness as primarily rest, lack of disturbance, repletion, unity at last, and the Sabbath of Sabbaths. To speak with the holy rhetorician Augustine, who was himself this sort of person. But if conflict and war affect such a nature as one more stimulus and goad to life, and if genuine proficiency and finesse in waging war with himself, which is to say, the ability to control and outwit himself, are inherited and cultivated, along with his most powerful and irreconcilable drives, then what emerge are those amazing, incomprehensible, and unthinkable ones, those human riddles destined for victory and for seduction. Alcibiades and Caesar are the most exquisite expressions of this type, and I will gladly set by their side that first European after my taste, the Hohenstaufen Friedrich II, and among artists perhaps Leonardo da Vinci. They appear in exactly those ages when that weaker type, with his longing for peace, comes to the fore. These types belong together and derive from the same set of causes. As long as herd utility is the only utility governing moral value judgments, as long as the preservation of the community is the only thing in view, and questions concerning immorality are limited to those things that seem to threaten the survival of the community. As long as this is the case, there cannot yet be a morality of neighbor love. Suppose that, even here, consideration, pity, propriety, gentleness, and reciprocity of aid are already practiced in a small but steady way. Suppose that, even in this state of society, all the drives that would later come to be called by the honorable names of virtue, and in the end, basically coincide with the concept of morality. Suppose that they are already active. At this point, they still do not belong to the realm of moral valuations at all. They are still extra-moral. During the best days of Rome, for instance, an act done out of pity was not called either good or evil, moral or immoral. And if it were praised on its own, the praise would be perfectly compatible with a type of reluctant disdain as soon as it was held up against any action that served to promote the common good, the res publica. Ultimately, the love of the neighbor is always somewhat conventional, willfully feigned, and beside the point, compared to fear of the neighbor. After the structure of society seems on the whole to be established and secured against external dangers, it is this fear of the neighbor that again creates new perspectives of moral valuation. Until now, in the spirit of common utility, certain strong and dangerous drives such as enterprise, daring, vindictiveness, cunning, rapacity, and a domineering spirit must have been not only honored under different names than these, of course, but nurtured and cultivated. Since, given the threats to the group, they were constantly needed against the common enemies. Now, however, since there are no more escape valves for these drives, they are seen as twice as dangerous, and one by one, they are denounced as immoral and abandoned to slander. Now, the opposite drives and inclinations come into moral favor. Step by step, the herd instinct draws its conclusion. How much or how little danger there is to the community or to equality in an opinion, in a condition or affect, in a will, in a talent. This is now the moral perspective, and fear is once again the mother of morality. When the highest and strongest drives erupt in passion, driving the individual up and out and far above the average, over the depths of the herd conscience, the self-esteem of the community is destroyed. Its faith in itself, its backbone, as it were, is broken. As a result, these are the very drives that will be denounced and slandered the most. A high, independent spiritedness, a will to stand alone, even an excellent faculty of reason, will be perceived as a threat. Everything that raises the individual over the herd and frightens the neighbor will henceforth be called evil. The proper, modest, unobtrusive, equalizing attitude and the mediocrity of desires acquire moral names and honors. Finally, in very peaceable circumstances, there are fewer and fewer opportunities and less need to nurture an instinct for severity or hardness. And now every severity starts disturbing the conscience, even where justice is concerned. A high and hard nobility and self-reliance is almost offensive and provokes suspicion. The lamb and the sheep, even more, gains respect. There is a point in the history of a society when it becomes pathologically innervated and tenderized, and it takes sides, quite honestly and earnestly, with those who do it harm, with criminals. Punishment that seems somehow unjust to this society. It certainly finds the thoughts of punishment and needing to punish both painful and frightening. Isn't it enough to render him unthreatening? Why punish him as well? Punishment is itself fearful. With these questions, the herd morality, the morality of timidity, draws its final consequences. If the threat, the reason for the fear, could be totally abolished, this morality would be abolished as well. It would not be necessary anymore. It would not consider itself necessary anymore. Anyone who probes the conscience of today's European will have to extract the very same imperative from 1,000 moral folds and hiding places. The imperative of herd timidity. We want the day to come when there is nothing more to fear. The day to come, the will and way to that day, is now called progress everywhere in Europe. Let us immediately repeat what we have already said 100 times before. Since there are no ready ears for such truths, for our truths these days, we know all too well how offensive it sounds when someone classifies human beings as animals without disguises or allegory. And we are considered almost sinful for constantly using expressions like herd and herd instinct, with direct reference to people of modern ideas. So what? We cannot help ourselves, since this is where our new insights happen to lie. Europe, we have found, has become unanimous in all major moral judgments. And this includes the countries under Europe's influence. People in Europe clearly know what Socrates claimed not to know, and what that famous old snake once promised to teach. People these days know what is good and evil. Now it must sound harsh and strike the ear quite badly when we keep insisting on the following point. What it is that claims to know here. What glorifies itself with its praise and reproach and calls itself good is the instinct of the herd animal man, which has come to the fore, gaining and continuing to gain predominance and supremacy over the other instincts, in accordance with the growing physiological approach and approximation whose symptom it is. Morality in Europe these days is the morality of herd animals. And therefore, as we understand things, it is only one type of human morality beside which, before which, and after which many other and especially higher moralities are or should be possible. But this morality fights tooth and nail against such a possibility and such a should. It stubbornly and ruthlessly declares, I am morality itself and nothing else is moral. And in fact, with the aid of a religion that indulged and flattered the loftiest herd desires, things have reached the point where this morality is increasingly apparent in even political and social institutions. The democratic movement is the heir to Christianity. But there are indications that the tempo of this morality is still much too slow and lethargic for those who have less patience, those who are sick or addicted to the above-mentioned instinct. This is attested to by the increasingly frantic howling, the increasingly undisguised snarling of the anarchist dogs that now wander the alleyways of European culture, in apparent opposition to the peaceable and industrious democrats and ideologists of revolution, and still more to the silly philosophisters and brotherhood enthusiasts who call themselves socialists and want a free society. But, in fact, they are one and all united in thorough and instinctive hostility towards all forms of society besides that of the autonomous herd, even to the point of rejecting the concepts of master and slave, reads a socialist formula. They are united in their dogged opposition to any special claims, special rights, or privileges, which means, in the last analysis, that they are opposed to any rights, since when everyone is equal, no one will need rights anymore. They are united in their mistrust of punitive justice, as if it were a violation of those who are weaker, a wrong against the necessary result of all earlier societies. But they are likewise united in the religion of pity, in sympathy for whatever feels, lives, suffers, down to the animal and up to God. The excessive notion of pity for God belongs in a democratic age. They are all united in the cries and the impatience of pity, in deadly hatred against suffering in general, in the almost feminine inability to sit watching, to let suffering happen. They are united in the way They involuntarily raise the general level of sensitivity and gloom under whose spell Europe seems threatened with a new Buddhism. They are united in their faith in the morality of communal pity, as if it were morality in itself, the height, the achieved height of humanity, the sole hope for the future, the solace of the present, the great redemption of all guilt from the past. They are all united in their faith in the community as Redeemer, which is to say, in the herd, in themselves. We who have a different faith, we who consider the democratic movement to be not merely an abased form of political organization, but rather an abased, more specifically a diminished form of humanity, a mediocrization and a depreciation of humanity in value. Where do we need to reach with our hopes? Towards new philosophers? There is no alternative. Towards spirits who are strong and original enough to give impetus to opposed valuations and initiate a revaluation and reversal of eternal values. Towards those sent out ahead, towards the men of the future who in the present tie the knots and gather the force that compels the will of millennia into new channels, to teach humanity its future as its will, as dependent on a human will, to prepare for the great risk and wholesale attempt at breeding and cultivation, and so to put an end to the gruesome rule of chance and nonsense that has passed for history so far, the nonsense of the greatest number is only its latest form. A new type of philosopher and commander will be needed for this some day. And whatever hidden, dreadful, or benevolent spirits have existed on earth will pale into insignificance beside the image of this type. The image of such leaders hovers before our eyes. May I say this out loud, you free spirits? The conditions that would have to be partly created and partly exploited for them to come into being. The probable paths and trials that would enable a soul to grow tall and strong enough to feel the compulsion for these tasks. A revaluation of values whose new pressure and hammer will steel a conscience and transform a heart into bronze to bear the weight of a responsibility like this. And, on the other hand, the necessity of such leaders, the terrible danger that they could fail to appear or simply fail and degenerate. These are our real worries in dark clouds. Do you know this, you free spirits? These are the heavy, distant thoughts and storms that traverse the sky of our lives. There are few pains as intense as ever having seen, guessed, or sympathized while an extraordinary person ran off course and degenerated. But someone with an uncommon eye for the overall danger that humanity itself will degenerate. Someone like us who has recognized the outrageous contingency that has been playing games with the future of humanity so far. Games in which no hand and not even a finger of God has taken part. Someone who has sensed the disaster that lies hidden in the idiotic guidelessness and credulity of modern ideas, and still more in the whole of Christian European morality. Someone like this will suffer from an unparalleled sense of alarm. In a single glance, he will comprehend everything that could be bred from humanity. Given a favorable accumulation and intensification of forces and tasks, he will know with all the prescience of his conscience how humanity has still not exhausted its greatest possibilities, and how often the type man has already faced mysterious decisions in new paths. He will know even better from his most painful memories these sorts of miserable things that generally shatter, crush, sink, and turn a development of the highest rank into a miserable affair. The total degeneration of humanity, down to what today's socialist fools and nitwits see as their man of the future, as their ideal. This degeneration and diminution of humanity into the perfect herd animal, or as they say, into man in a free society. This brutalizing process of turning humanity into stunted little animals with equal rights and equal claims is no doubt possible. Anyone who has ever thought this possibility through to the end knows one more disgust than other men, and perhaps a new task as well. Okay, that's the end of part 5 of Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche.